The night before the rope was meant to end him, Jonah Crow sat alone in the narrow cell beneath the gallows, listening to the wind as it crept through the wooden beams above like a living thing that remembered every neck it had ever taken, and for the first time in many years he was not afraid of death but of memory, because memory had teeth sharper than any lawman's bullet, and as the lantern outside his cell guttered and swayed, casting long shadows that stretched and bent like accusing fingers, Jonah leaned back against the cold stone and let his thoughts spill free, knowing there would be no morning left to stop them, no pardon riding in at the last second, no miracle earned by a life that had taken far more than it had ever given, and so he began to speak softly to the empty dark, not for the guards, not for God, but for himself, confessing a truth buried so deep that even his own legend had never touched it, the truth behind the blood-soaked stories that had turned his name into something mothers used to frighten children and men used to measure their courage against, because Jonah Crow had not always been an outlaw and he had not always been cruel, and the first life he ever ruined had been his own long before he ruined anyone else's, back when he was just Jonah, a quiet boy with dirt under his nails and a head full of hope, raised on a small stretch of land where the grass bent gold in the sun and the night smelled of sage and rain, a place he had loved with the simple devotion of someone who did not yet know how easily love could be taken, and it was there that he first learned what fear truly was, not from guns or fists, but from watching men with badges ride in and decide that a piece of paper mattered more than a family, more than years of work, more than a promise spoken under an open sky, and Jonah remembered how his father had stood tall that day, voice steady even as his hands shook, insisting the land was theirs, that the debt had been paid, that there had to be some mistake. And Jonah remembered the sound of a rifle shot splitting the air when his father refused to step aside, remembered how his mother's scream seemed to tear the world in half, and how something inside him went quiet forever as he knelt in the dust beside a body that would never rise again, because that was the moment Jonah learned that the law did not always mean justice, and justice did not always belong to the innocent, and in the years that followed, as he drifted from ranch to camp to trail, carrying anger like a second spine, he learned to survive by hardening himself, by turning his back on mercy before it could turn its back on him, until survival became theft, and theft became violence, and violence became a language he spoke fluently, though it tasted bitter every time, and still, even then, there had been one secret that never fit the legend, one truth no wanted poster ever hinted at, because behind every train robbery and gunfight, behind every cold look and fast draw, there was a reason Jonah never killed unless he had no other choice, a reason he aimed to wound when he could and why he sometimes let men run when the smart thing would have been to leave no witnesses, and that reason had a name he had not spoken out loud in more than 20 years, a name that stirred the air of the cell as he whispered it now, low and rough like a prayer worn thin, because once, long before he became the man the West feared, Jonah Crow had loved someone with a quiet, steady love that did not demand much, only honesty, and her name was Eliza Moore, the schoolteacher who arrived in his town with a single trunk and eyes too kind for a place like that, and Jonah remembered how she looked at him not as a threat or a tool, but as a man who might still choose to be better, how she spoke to him without fear even after she learned what he had done to survive, and how her belief had frightened him more than any gun ever could, because it showed him the shape of the life he could never have, and when the law finally caught up with him years later, when the trap was sprung and the betrayal came from a man he once spared, it was Eliza who paid the highest price, not with her life, but with her future, because Jonah had surrendered that day not to save himself but to save her, stepping out into the open with his hands raised so she would not be taken as leverage, so she would not be dragged into the mud of his sins, and the legend said Jonah Crow fought until the end, that it took 6 men to bring him down, but the truth was quieter and far more painful, because Jonah had chosen the rope long before the trial ever began. And now, sitting beneath the gallows with the wind humming like a distant hymn, he confessed the final truth no one would ever hear, that every crime he committed after losing her had been an attempt to erase the man he had once been, that every hard choice was made to keep others from suffering the way his family had, that the blood on his hands was real and heavy but not born of pleasure, and as the night deepened and the stars shifted unseen above the roof of the jail, Jonah Crow closed his eyes and imagined Eliza somewhere far from this place, older now, perhaps still teaching, perhaps still believing that people were more than their worst moments, and for the first time since boyhood, he allowed himself to hope not for escape or forgiveness, but for understanding, because even if the world remembered him only as a monster, the truth would still exist in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, and as the wind whispered through the gallows one last time, Jonah finished his confession with a breath so soft it barely stirred the air, unaware that somewhere beyond the jail walls, beyond the stories already written about him. A single choice made long ago was about to change how his legend would one day be told. They called her the widow of Red Mesa long before anyone learned her real name. And when Mara called a step down from the stagecoach beneath the white glare of the desert sun, the town of Red Mesa seemed to hold its breath as if afraid she might hear it breathing, because fear had a sound here, a low hush that followed her wherever she went, a silence shaped by stories whispered behind saloon doors and passed between poker hands, stories that said every outlaw who had ever loved her met a violent end, that she carried death the way other women carried perfume, light and invisible until it was too late, and Mara felt those stories settle on her shoulders. As she walked down the dusty street with her black dress clutched at the hem, her face calm, her eyes distant, already tired of a reputation she had never chosen, because she had come to Red Mesa not to haunt it but to disappear, to live quietly on the edge of town in the small adobe house left to her by a cousin she barely remembered, a house with cracked walls and a crooked door that groaned like an old animal when the wind pushed against it, and in the early days she spoke little and worked hard, tending a dry patch of land that resisted her efforts, hauling water from the well before dawn, sewing by lamplight at night, keeping her grief folded neatly inside her where no one could touch it, for grief was something she knew well, having buried one husband under a cottonwood tree and another beneath a sky filled with gun smoke, both men outlaws, both men restless and hungry for the kind of freedom the West promised but never delivered, and though she had loved them in different ways, the ending had been the same, sudden and brutal, leaving her with memories sharper than knives and a heart that learned to beat quietly so it would not draw attention, and so the men of Red Mesa watched her from a distance, respectful and afraid in equal measure, because none of them wished to become the next cautionary tale, and Mara accepted their distance as a kind of mercy, until the afternoon fate came bleeding to her door, carried on unsteady feet and desperation, when the sun was sinking low and the desert air shimmered like a fever dream, and she heard a sound outside her house that did not belong to the wind or the birds or the distant hum of town life, a rough, broken sound, half a breath and half a groan, and when she opened the door she found a man collapsed against her wall, dust-caked and pale, one hand pressed tight against his side where blood seeped through his fingers, his hat fallen beside him like something already abandoned, and for a moment Mara stood frozen, because she recognized the look on his face, the look of someone who had traveled too far on borrowed strength, someone who had not expected kindness at the end of the road, and the sensible thing would have been to close the door, to call for help or leave him to the town, but something older and quieter moved her instead, something that remembered other wounded men and the cost of turning away, and so she dragged him inside with more strength than she knew she possessed, laid him on her narrow bed, and worked in silence as she cleaned the wound and bound it tight, her hand steady even as her heart beat too fast, and when he finally opened his eyes hours later, the light from the lantern soft on his face, he looked at her as if he had crossed into another world, and whispered a simple thank you that sounded like a promise he did not yet understand, and his name, he told her later, was Luke Harlan, a gunslinger by necessity rather than pride, a man who had been running from one mistake to the next, never staying long enough to set down roots, and as the days passed and his strength returned, he remained in her house, moving carefully, helping where he could, fixing the door hinge, carrying water, never asking questions about her past and never offering details of his own unless she asked, and in that quiet space something fragile began to form, not a wildfire love but a slow, cautious warmth built from shared meals and long silences, from the way Luke listened when Mara spoke and the way she learned the rhythm of his presence, the limp that lingered when he thought she was not watching, the sadness he carried behind his easy smile, and Red Mesa noticed, of course, because towns always do, and the whispers returned sharper than before, men shaking their heads and warning Luke in low voices that he was tempting fate, that the widow's love ended in graves, and Luke would come home unsettled but determined, telling Mara he did not believe in curses or stories, that he believed only in the woman who had saved his life, but Mara did believe, not in curses exactly, but in patterns, in the cruel way the world seemed to circle back on itself, and at night she would lie awake listening to Luke breathe and wonder how long it would be before something came for him, before the desert claimed another man who had dared to care for her, and she tried to push him away gently, telling him he should leave once he was healed, that Red Mesa was no place for him, but Luke only smiled sadly and said he was tired of running, tired of letting fear decide his path, and when he finally kissed her it was soft and uncertain, a question rather than a demand, and she answered it not with words but by resting her forehead against his, breathing him in like a moment stolen from time, knowing even then that happiness felt sharpest when it was borrowed, and the town watched them grow closer beneath the burning western sun, watched the way Luke walked beside her through the market, watched the way she smiled a little more easily, and waited for the other shoe to drop, because the West had taught them that love rarely went unpunished, and the punishment came one evening in the form of a rider carrying old grudges and a familiar kind of violence, a man from Luke's past who had tracked him to Red Mesa with revenge in his eyes, and when the shots rang out near the edge of town, Mara felt the sound hit her chest like a physical blow, because she knew that sound too well, and she ran toward it even as people shouted for her to stop, and she found Luke standing in the dust. Gun lowered, blood on his sleeve that was not his own, alive but shaken, and for a moment the world held still. And it seemed as though perhaps the pattern had been broken at last, but as Luke looked at her, relief flooding his face, Mara felt the weight of every story settle back into place, because she understood then that surviving was not the same as escaping, that as long as Luke stayed, danger would follow, drawn not by her love but by his past, and that loving him meant choosing between her heart and his life, and as they stood there beneath the darkening sky, the town silent around them, Mara made a decision that would tear at her long after the dust had settled, a decision she did not yet speak aloud, but which shaped itself in her eyes as she reached for Luke's hand one last time, knowing that fate was watching closely, and that whatever came next would not be gentle. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten what law looked like, not all at once but slowly, the way rock creeps into wood until one day the beam snaps, and by the time the broken marshal rode in beneath a sky the color of old steel, the town barely bothered to look up, because hope had been beaten out of the place years ago by crooked card games, back-alley shootings, and men who wore guns the way other men wore smiles, easy and careless, and the marshal knew this the moment his horse's hooves hit the dirt street and no one moved aside, knew it in the way the saloon doors didn't stop swinging and the way the few shopkeepers watching from their windows looked through him instead of at him, as if he were already a ghost, which in some ways he was, because Caleb Rourke had died once before in a place much like this, died the day he failed to save Deadwood Crossing the first time, back when he had ridden in younger and straighter, believing a badge meant something more than a target on your chest, believing that if you stood firm long enough the world would bend toward right, and as he dismounted slowly now, favoring the knee that never healed proper, the badge pinned to his coat felt heavier than any chain, a piece of metal he had sworn never to wear again after it cost him his wife, his child, and the quiet life he had almost earned, and yet here he was, because some promises do not loosen their grip no matter how far you run, and Deadwood Crossing had called him back not with words but with need, with the simple truth that no one else would come, that the territory had written the town off as a loss, and that if Caleb didn't try again, there would be nothing left but ash and unmarked graves, and the man waiting for him was the same one who had broken the town years before, a cattle baron named Harlan Pike whose money had bought guns and silence in equal measure. A man who smiled easily and killed carefully, never pulling a trigger himself but always making sure someone else did, and Caleb remembered Pike well, remembered how he had underestimated him once, how he had tried to play by rules Pike had already burned, and how that failure had ended with a house in flames and the sound of his wife screaming trapped inside, a sound that followed him into every sleepless night since, and as Caleb walked toward the jailhouse that afternoon, dust clinging to his boots, he felt those ghosts rise up, not to warn him away but to demand something of him, because this time there would be no reinforcements, no clean lines between good men and bad, only a town full of frightened souls who had learned to survive by keeping their heads down, and Caleb understood fear better than most, understood how it could hollow a person out until all that was left was breath and habit, and so he did not make speeches or demand loyalty, he simply cleaned the jail, fixed the broken door, and sat on the porch at night where everyone could see him, a reminder that someone was watching, and slowly, almost against their will, the people of Deadwood Crossing began to notice, began to feel something shift, because there was a difference between a man passing through and one who stayed, and Caleb stayed even when Pike's men tested him, even when bullets cracked into the dirt near his feet and laughter followed, even when the bartender warned him quietly that Pike had already decided how this would end, and as the days passed, the town prepared for war the way people always do when they know violence is coming but don't know where it will land, hiding children, stockpiling food, whispering prayers that felt too small for the danger ahead, and Caleb felt the weight of every life pressing on him, because leadership was a lonely thing when it was real, because he knew that no matter how this played out, someone would not see another sunrise, and the ghosts of his past failure pressed closer as the tension grew, reminding him of every wrong call, every hesitation, every moment he chose restraint when ruthlessness might have saved lives, and on the night Pike finally made his move, riding in with a dozen armed men and a confidence earned through years of unchecked power, Caleb stood alone in the street beneath a moon sharp enough to cut, his hand steady on the grip of his revolver, his heart loud but clear, because this time he would not bargain, would not wait for permission from a world that had already abandoned this place, and when Pike sneered and asked him how many times he planned to lose the same fight, Caleb answered with a truth pulled straight from the scars on his soul, telling him that some losses carve lessons so deep they never fade, and that tonight he intended to remember every one of them, and the gunfire that followed shattered the quiet. Deadwood Crossing had grown used to, echoing off buildings like thunder trapped in a box, and Caleb moved through it with grim purpose, not fast, not flashy, but certain, driven by a resolve sharpened by grief, and when the smoke cleared and Pike lay bleeding in the dirt, his power finally broken, Caleb did not feel victory so much as release, because justice rarely feels clean when it comes late. And as dawn crept over the town and the survivors stepped out into the open, blinking at a future they had not dared imagine, Caleb Rourke stood alone again, exhausted and wounded, knowing that even if Deadwood Crossing survived this night, his ghosts would not be so easily laid to rest, because the badge he wore had been paid for in blood once already, and before this was over, it might demand its price again. They said Black Canyon swallowed light the way a mouth swallows breath, and when Silas Boone first unfolded the cracked, wall-stained map beneath a flickering lantern, he felt the truth of those words settle into his bones, because the lines drawn there were not clean or certain but crooked and hesitant, as if the hand that made them had trembled with knowledge it wished to forget, and Silas told himself that fear was just another kind of hunger, one he could not afford now that the world had finally run out of patience with him, because desperation has a way of sharpening hope into something dangerous, and Silas had been desperate for a long time, drifting from claim to claim, town to town, always one season behind fortune, always arriving after the easy gold had been scraped clean, and so when the old prospector died in the back room of a mining shack and left the map tucked into Silas's hands with a look that begged forgiveness more than thanks, Silas did not ask questions he was afraid to hear answered. He simply packed his mule and rode toward Black Canyon under a sky that felt too close, too watchful, the desert stretching out around him in waves of heat and silence that pressed against his thoughts, and at first the whispers came softly, so softly he mistook them for wind slipping through stone, murmurs that rose and fell without words, but as he traveled deeper into the canyon's reach, those sounds grew clearer, shaping themselves into promises spoken in familiar tones, voices that sounded like men he once knew, partners long dead or lost, calling his name as if from just beyond the next ridge, and Silas told himself it was thirst, exhaustion. The tricks a lonely mind plays when there is nothing to anchor it but the rhythm of hooves and the weight of regret, yet the map seemed to pull him onward with a certainty his own will no longer possessed, guiding him past dead trees twisted into shapes that suggested pain frozen mid-cry, past rock walls streaked dark as if stained by old fires or older sins, and when he finally reached the narrow pass marked by a jagged symbol on the map, the air changed, growing heavy and still, as though the canyon itself had drawn a slow breath and was waiting to see what he would do next, and Silas dismounted. There, his mule restless, eyes rolling white, refusing to go farther no matter how gently he coaxed, and alone on foot, Silas followed the map into a place where the sun seemed dimmer and sound behaved strangely, his own footsteps echoing back at him with a delay that made his skin prickle, and it was there that the whispers spoke clearly for the first time, not as many voices but as one, low and intimate, telling him he was close, telling him the gold lay just ahead, telling him that the canyon rewarded those brave enough to listen, and Silas felt a thrill cut through his fear, because all his life he had been told he was too cautious, too slow to seize opportunity, and now opportunity seemed to be reaching out to him, urging him onward, and when he found the vein at last, gleaming faintly within the rock face like a hidden vein beneath skin, his breath left him in a rush that felt almost like prayer, because the gold was real, richer than anything he had ever seen, thick enough to change everything, to buy time and forgiveness and a future that did not end in a shallow grave, and as he chipped at the stone with shaking hands, the whispers grew warmer, approving, telling him he had earned this, that suffering was a kind of payment, and Silas worked until his muscles screamed and his mind blurred, until the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened into shapes that watched him work, and only when he finally stopped to rest did he notice what the map had not shown. The old marks carved into the canyon walls, symbols worn smooth by time but unmistakable in their warning, because this place had been found before, worked before, abandoned before, and the whispers shifted then, their tone changing from invitation to demand, reminding Silas that nothing taken from Black Canyon came without a cost, and that the price was always paid in pieces of the soul rather than coin. And when night fell fully and the canyon filled with darkness thick as velvet, Silas felt memories rise unbidden, memories he had buried beneath years of wandering, of a brother he once left behind for a chance at quick profit, of promises broken and letters never written, and the whispers pressed closer, telling him the gold could make those things right if only he listened, if only he stayed, if only he gave a little more of himself. And Silas realized too late that the canyon did not want his life or his body but his willingness to forget who he had been before greed hollowed him out, wanted him to trade memory for metal, and as the hours stretched thin and sleep refused to come, he saw figures moving at the edge of his vision, men bent beneath burdens of ore, faces empty, eyes reflecting gold instead of light, and he understood then why none of the others had ever returned, because they had not died so much as faded, absorbed into the canyon's long hunger, and with dawn approaching like a pale promise he did not trust, Silas made his choice, leaving the gold where it lay and turning back toward the narrow pass, the whispers rising in anger and sorrow both, telling him he was a fool, telling him he would regret this for the rest of his life, and maybe he would, because regret is a quieter curse that lasts longer than most. But as he stumbled out of Black Canyon and felt the sun warm his face once more, the whispers finally fell silent. And though Silas Boone would never be rich and would always carry the memory of what he walked away from, he also carried something rarer, the knowledge that some legends are warnings rather than invitations, and that the West, for all its promises, never gives without taking something back, truth etched deep into the stone of Black Canyon, waiting patiently for the next desperate soul to come listening.